If people go to only one source and the source they go to is sick and has an agenda and they're putting out disinformation, our First Amendment stands as a major block to the ability to be able to just hammer it out of existence.
You might have seen the John Kerry story when he said, "Wouldn't it be bizarre and hypocritical of me to be a green czar and travel the world on a private jet? Wouldn't that be somewhat implausible and ridiculous? Wouldn't that be the kind of craziness that would expose us as hypocrites?" Well, he's now saying that the First Amendment is dangerous. Many of you will have seen that. Let's have a look at Elon Musk's reaction to that. Who's pushing this madness? Just say the quiet part out loud now. Is it time to torch the Constitution? Or that was a comparable event on a similar document. Let's have a look at John Kerry's claim that the First Amendment is a major block to curbing misinformation.
And I think the dislike of and anguish over social media is just growing and growing and growing. And it's part of our problem, particularly in democracies, in terms of building consensus around any issue. It's really hard to govern today. You can't, the referees we used to have to determine what's a fact and what isn't a fact have kind of, been eviscerated to a certain degree. And people self-select where they go for their news or for their information. And then you just get into a vicious cycle. So it's really, really hard, much harder to build consensus today than at any time in the 45, 50 years I've been involved in this. And there's a lot of discussion now about how you curb those entities in order to guarantee that you're going to have, some accountability on facts, et cetera. But look, if people go to only one source and the source they go to is sick and, has an agenda and they're putting out disinformation, our First Amendment stands as a major block to the ability to be able to just, hammer it out of existence. So what we need is to win the ground, win the right to govern by hopefully having, winning enough votes that you're free to be able to implement change.
What's extraordinary about that is that John Kerry, when describing a mandate derived from an electoral victory, casually says, hopefully we'll have the power then to change. The change he's discussing is the ability to censor and control you. Like, if their real concern was protecting people from misinformation, would the world look like it does now? Like, when it comes to rampant corporatism, vagrancy, homelessness, despair, fentanyl crisis. Like, remember, the Democrat Party is already in office. What are they doing about vagrancy, despair, corporatism, globalism? Remember Joe Biden claiming that Big Pharma had been beaten when ultimately meaningless regulatory controls have been placed on 10 medications. The only kind of victories you'll be offered are Pyrrhic, meaningless victories that will not curtail the power or excesses of corporatism. I was with Bobby Kennedy listening to how he would control, limit and curtail the excesses of the CDC and NIH were he to be granted the opportunity as a result of an election victory. I can't tell you how different it sounds from what John Kerry is saying. Technocrats and bureaucrats being cast out en masse. Clinical trials being conducted to ensure that medicines benefit the people that they are being prescribed to, rather than the endless cycle of new drugs being introduced for profit. Can you imagine how different the pandemic period would have been in your country if men like Jay Bhattacharya and Bobby Kennedy had been in charge of your government's medical program and the pandemic planning and handling? Would there even have been a pandemic? In my country, Boris Johnson recently said, "I'm no longer sure medieval lockdowns beat COVID." Boris Johnson has said that he acknowledges that during the pandemic in our country, the UK, it was mishandled and mismanaged. This is the article. He said he's no longer sure lockdowns played a decisive role in defeating COVID. Mr. Johnson writes in his memoir that he initially believed lockdowns were having a suppressing effect on the virus. It was only later, he says, that I started to look at the curves of the pandemic around the world, the double hump that seemed to... Look at him making it sound like it was a response to demographics and medical insights rather than just a giddy and authoritarian whirl. What we're seeing now is people that were in power during the pandemic period are being confronted with the recklessness of their controlling mechanisms during that period. John Kerry, it seems to me, might even believe that he is on the right side of history, as they say, acting on behalf of righteousness. But when you hear someone advocate for censorship under the auspices of protection, you know you can't rely on them. You know you can't rely on them. Always the authoritarianism is dressed up as care these days.
Now, obviously, there are some people in our country who are prepared to implement change in other ways. And so that's really dangerous.
You're questioning really if democracy can survive unregulated social media?
I think democracies are very challenged right now and have not proven they can move fast enough or big enough to deal with the challenges that we are facing. And to me, that is part of what this race, this election is all about. Will we break the fever in the United States?
Will we break the fever indeed in the United States? My great revelation around John Kerry came when I saw him before a congressional hearing dealing with a subject of his own private jet and whether it was ethical or potentially hypocritical that he was using a private jet to fly around the world lecturing people on climate change. The reason I bring this up is because of the obvious hypocrisy of lecturing people on climate change when you're flying around in a private jet. It's comparable to the lack of true virtue and principles that undergird their modality when it comes to the subject of free speech. When they say they need the power to control misinformation and malinformation, they neglect to express that what they mean is they want to control information that's not favourable to their agenda. There is no permanent principle. If there was a permanent principle, we would have to address the significant misinformation that came out during the pandemic period. Let me know in the comments in the chat who you feel generated the most misinformation during the pandemic period. Was it people online who expressed concerns about adverse reactions after vaccines? Was it the various people that spoke out against vaccines and pandemic lockdown measures? Or was it the media that advocated aggressively for taking not only the initial mRNA shots, but subsequent boosters? I think we would have to say, in retrospect, that the majority of misinformation came from the government and the media.
We can't continue to bring you this beautiful content without the support of our partners. Senolytics are the biggest discovery for promoting healthy aging. The aging process obviously isn't our friend, unless I suppose, there's eternal life. But while we're here, we want to be energetic and productive. That's why I use Qualia Senolytic with science-backed ingredients that have helped me feel, I would say, 15 years younger in a matter of just months. Everyone accumulates senescent cells, known as zombie cells. These senescent cells are old and worn out and not fulfilling a useful function for our health, but they take up space and nutrients from our healthy cells. Qualia Senolytic removes zombie cells and allow healthy cells to thrive. Resist aging at the cellular level. Try Qualia Senolytic. Go to QUALIA.com/brand for up to, get this, 50% off, and use the code BRAND at the checkout for an additional 15% off. Try it now. Qualia Senolytic is also available at select GNC locations near you. Take it. Just 2 days a month. There's a link in the description. Who don't want to feel 15 years younger and get rid of them zombie cells?
Remember, John Kerry, for a minute, could have been the president of your country. But given the way that he has handled being a climate czar, and given the way he handled this conversation around his private jet travelling to various climate conferences, I don't think this is a person that can be trusted with significant power. Let's have a look at that now. In the context of John Kerry's recent claims that what's required is a mandate in order to control misinformation. When they say misinformation, I believe what they mean is information that might galvanize the citizenry, may inform us that we could critically think and discern, organize and oppose centralized power. Let's have a look at John Kerry denying under oath that he ever owned a private jet.
I just don't agree with your facts, which began with the presentation of one of the most outrageously persistent lies that I hear, which is this private jet. We don't own a private jet. I don't own a private jet.
I've never owned a private jet. What are these claims that I've got a private jet? I'm sick and tired of hearing about this. Let's bury the hatchet once and for all. And if we're controlling misinformation, it's about helping people.
Personally, I've never owned a private jet. And obviously, it's pretty stupid to talk about coming in a private jet from the State Department up here.
Let me just say that out loud. To come from the State Department up here in a private jet would almost make ridiculous and risible everything else that I'm about to say in the context of carbon emissions and climate control. It would make it look like powerful people have only this concern: the imposition of authority from above on people beneath them, while they themselves quite literally soar in the heavens, privately, in a jet.
Just honestly, if that's where you want to go there.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter into the record article here from February 15th of 2023. The John Kerry family private jet was sold shortly after accusations of climate hypocrisy. Mr. Secretary, do you stand by that testimony that you've never owned or
I personally,
your family? By your family?
Personally, yes.
Personally. I personally don't own a private. My wife, that bitch, she loves private jets. Sometimes she'd drag me up in there. No one could do anything about it because it was so private. I was up there in that private jet, flying around. Carbon was being emitted everywhere. I was going from conference to conference against my will with no consent in that bitch's goddamn private jet. The minute I found out, I was looking around that jet. Why is there nobody else on here? Why don't I have to turn my phone off? How come no one's hassling me about a seatbelt? It's because it's private. You've done it again, you bitch.
My wife owned a plane, and so the plane.
You flew on that plane?
Not in a number of years, but I have flown on it, sure.
I mean, it's difficult to remember. Listen, look, this is a lot of misinformation. Can't we shut this misinformation down about that bitch, my wife, and her private jet that she dragged me on against my will? Can't we just get rid of the First Amendment so that I can fly freely in the sky, a simple hostage of my wife up there?
This article is not then inaccurate, that your family owned a plane. You flew on a plane.
My wife owned the plane.
Here's the issue.
Yeah.
This isn't some kind of partisan gotcha. When we are asking Americans to make serious sacrifices as we transition for the common good, and your family and or yourself are flying around on private jets, that smacks of hypocrisy. It actually hurts your cause, Mr. Secretary, but I'll move on. I just want to know from a record standpoint.
Afford me the right, at least to set the record straight here. I do not fly on a private jet. I do not fly. I fly commercially.
Have you flown on a private jet in a personal or official capacity since you've taken this position?
Possibly once.
I might have done. You'd have to ask my wife. She makes the decisions around here. Look at how easily he manages his reality. Do you see what happens when people's identity is attacked? Really, I think what's happening on a spiritual level is people have grown attached to concepts that are abstract and outside of themselves instead of deep virtues and principles that can anchor us to the only reality that matters. What is your identity when it comes to God? What is your identity in the transcendent hereafter? What does all of this really matter? What are we doing down here on this plane, scrabbling around vainly for attention? And when I say vainly, I mean both in terms of its futility and in terms of the vanity. Here we all are, a vapour, a mist, waiting to expire, squabbling about molecules here in infinity. John Kerry's claims about misinformation John Kerry's claims about planes are absurd only because it's a revelation that he, like us, is a flawed human being doing his best to play his part and failing dreadfully. How might we succeed together if we were to focus on virtue rather than focusing on self? If you're anything like me, you will struggle on a daily basis not to lapse into selfishness and self-centeredness, not to put your own comfort ahead of your own principles. And before you know it, you're flying around to climate conferences on a private jet, speaking freely on a stage, making claims about the First Amendment and misinformation and how the First Amendment might need to be further amended to reverse its original meaning. You've got an election coming up in your country soon. During this election, you are going to have to be careful about misinformation. But I would say its primary sources are going to be the government of the United States of America, and they're going to be the legacy media. And what we're going to try and do on this channel between now and then, with our little team on the move, failing, flawed and fallible, is to report to you honestly and openly with a variety of sources. I think power is funny. I think my own power and lack of power is funny. I think John Kerry's power and lack of power is funny. I think Kamala Harris is pretty funny. And Donald Trump at least seems to know that he's funny. What we're going to have to look at is what kind of country you want to inherit after your election in November, and whether or not there can be unity and cohesion and fairness, how complex subjects like immigration might be handled and managed so that it doesn't lapse into mindlessness and hate, and that any order, border, control comes from a place of virtue and principle rather than a place of loathing. But that's just what I think. Why don't you let me know what you think in the comments in the chat? If you're watching us on YouTube, remember that you have to like and subscribe and notify. Otherwise, you won't see our content over there.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you want to see more uncensored content where free speech can flourish, join our live stream. Click the link right here to watch the next video if you want to, or become a member of a growing movement. Download the Rumble app and you'll be informed every time we make a new piece of content. Stay free.